Buenas tardes tengan todos ustedes. A nombre del ITAM y del Departamento Académico del Derecho, es para mí un placer darles la bienvenida a este evento inaugural de la cátedra Ulises Schmill del Departamento de Derecho. Nos acompañan en esta ocasión el ministro Fernando Franco González Sala, de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación. El vicerrector del ITAM, el doctor Alejandro Hernandez Delgado. Gracias. El profesor Stanley Paulson. Y por supuesto, nuestro homenajeado, el profesor Ulises Schmill. Me gustaría dar algunas palabras de presentación de la cátedra, seguido de lo cual haré la presentación de nuestro invitado especial, el profesor Stanley Paulson, y le daré la palabra a él claramente. La cátedra Ulises Schmill reconoce la tradición de nuestro profesor Schmill y es en su honor. Y creo que huelga decir no solamente que es un distinguido jurista y teórico del derecho, sino que ha sido quizás el exponente más distinguido en habla hispana de la teoría kelseniana y quizás una de las mayores autoridades de la materia en el mundo de la teoría y la filosofía del derecho. Pero también considero destacar que la cátedra reconoce un valor que me parece notable, y es el valor de presentar cómo una sólida teoría del derecho sirve para la clarificación de los problemas jurídicos y de hecho hace avanzar los debates. Y esto creo que lo distingue como teórico porque ha puesto a lo largo de sus distintos años, por ejemplo en la Suprema Corte de Justicia, a prueba conceptos teóricos para hacer clarificaciones y avanzar problemas específicos de los conceptos jurídicos y de los sistemas jurídicos en general. Y creo que por esto hay que destacar este mérito notable de nuestro profesor. La cátedra no solamente tiene esta distinción honorífica, sino tiene una finalidad hacia el futuro, y es el presentar el estado actual de la discusión teórica en el mundo mediante la invitación de filósofos del derecho destacados que hacen una presentación novedosa de algún problema y después, mediante el debate, se presenta una publicación. Para la inauguración de la cátedra en esta primera edición, tenemos el gusto de tener entre nosotros al profesor Stanley Paulson. El profesor Paulson de la Universidad de Washington en San Luis, en Estados Unidos, es uno de las autoridades más reconocidas en el siglo XX en la teoría jurídica contemporánea, con su especial atención en el jurista vienés Hans Kelsen. Quizás una de las maneras de mostrar cómo el profesor Paulson es una autoridad en el tema es que para el 125 aniversario del natalicio de Hans Kelsen, la Cámara Alta del Parlamento austriaco lo invitó como el key speaker, el expositor de honor para la presentación del aniversario de Kelsen. El profesor Paulson además tiene una trayectoria amplísima, más de 170 artículos en revistas a lo largo de 15 años, libros, traducciones, y ha sido profesor visitante en las principales universidades del mundo. Es para nosotros un honor que esté con nosotros. Welcome, Professor Paulson. Thank you so much for being here with us. El profesor Paulson dará su conferencia en inglés. Para aquellos que estén interesados, hay traducción simultánea, y le dejo el micrófono al profesor Paulson. Muchísimas gracias.
I should like to begin by recognizing the members of the Presidium. First, of course, on this occasion, my colleague and good friend, Professor Schmill, Provost Hernandez, Justice Franco, Dean Sergio. And I not only recognize these good people, but I thank them warmly for their efforts in making it possible, not only for me, but also for my wife, to come to Mexico City. We're very happy to be here. And I might just add that one of the things we love about your city is the food. You present us with a cuisine that counts for us as a whole new world. Finally, I should also like to thank Professor Rodolfo Vazquez for staying in touch on the email over a period of months as preparations for this event moved forward, always efficiently and always with good cheer. And I should like to thank also Alejandro Hernandez, who on his own initiative and on short notice worked up a Spanish translation of my text. My paper is on empowerment, liability, and the pure theory of law. I begin an introductory section with some talk about two dilemmas. Hans Kelsen occupied himself with issues in legal philosophy over a period of more than 60 years, and the central concepts in his pure theory of law, basic norm, imputation, normativity, purity, and the like, are well known. Still, Kelsen's ultimate aim in legal philosophy has never emerged with much clarity. Two diametrically opposed approaches to Kelsen's legal philosophy, one stemming from Joseph Raz, the other from Robert Walter, illustrate the lack of consensus on the pure theory of law. Raz begins by contrasting Hart's position with Kelsen's. Hart is a proponent, Raz says, of social normativity, understanding, and I quote here, the normativity of the law and the obligation to obey it as distinct notions, end of quote. An altogether different understanding, Raz continues, is evident in the work of those who recognize, and I quote again, only the concept of justified normativity, end of quote, among them Hans Kelsen. As Raz writes, and I quote, to judge the law as normative is to judge it to be just and to grant that it ought to be obeyed. The concepts of the normativity of the law and of the obligation to obey it are analytically tied together. Kelsen therefore regards the law as valid, that is normative, only if one ought to obey it, end of quote. Raz sees the paradox in attributing justified normativity to Kelsen's, a thesis that places Kelsen far closer to natural law theory than to anything found in fact-based legal positivism. Indeed, Raz invites special attention to the paradox, writing that although, and I quote again, Kelsen rejects natural law theories, he consistently uses the natural law concept of normativity, that is, the concept of justified normativity. End of quote. Walter's interpretation of normativity in Kelsen's legal theory reduces the concept of normativity to matters of fact. In the pure theory of law, Walter writes, legal systems are to be interpreted, and I quote this time, of course, from Walter, as if they were normative, end of quote. An idea that stems from Hans Weininger, whom Kelsen, in fact, follows in his late period. Walter, however, understands Kelsen generally in terms of Weininger's as-if doctrine and not simply with respect to Kelsen's late period. These two approaches to the pure theory of law, Raz's and Walter's, are puzzling. Both writers offer interpretations of Kelsen's legal theory, but both interpretations represent extreme departures from Kelsen's two-sided purity postulate found at the very core of his theory. The postulate says that the pure theory of law is to be distinguished from all value-laden theories, be they moral, political, or ideological in character, and from all fact-based theories, that is, all forms of naturalism and psychologism. But Raz invokes, and I'm quoting his phrase, the natural law concept of normativity, end of quote, as the underlying notion in Kelsen's doctrine of normativity. And Walter, in appealing to Weyenger's as-if doctrine as an interpretation of Kelsen on normativity, is wedded to a fact-based interpretation of the pure theory of law. The first of two dilemmas is captured by bringing together these two interpretations, Rawls's representing elements of natural law theory and Walter's representing fact-based legal positivism. This first dilemma is Kelsen's own dilemma, that is, he sets the dilemma out, and he takes as his point of departure the two-sided purity postulate. It says, in effect, a pox on both your houses. Neither natural law theory nor fact-based legal positivism is defensible. Coupled with the doctrine tertium non datur, which some understand as demarcating the tradition in legal philosophy, Kelsen's purity postulate dooms every appeal to the tradition. Kelsen submits, however, that there is, after all, an escape from the dilemma, namely a third way, based on Kant's transcendental philosophy as expounded in his first critique. Kant's transcendental philosophy, Kelsen writes, is, and I quote, eminently qualified to provide the foundation for a positivistic legal and political theory, end of quote. And, as important as it is obvious, Kant's transcendental philosophy in the first critique appeals neither to morality nor to facts. So far, so good. Kelsen believes that he has escaped the dilemma faced by those who remain in the grip of the tradition. But this strategy of Kelsen's leads to a second dilemma. And this second dilemma takes the form of the critic's rejoinder to Kelsen. Here, the traditional legal theories together represent one horn of the dilemma, and Kelsen's adaptation of Kant's transcendental legal philosophy represents the other horn. The problem, quite simply, is that no Kantian transcendental argument, even if it should prove to be sound in the context of Kant's own theory, will pass muster when applied in one or another of the standing disciplines, here legal science. The transcendental argument presupposes that no alternative approach to the issue at hand exists. In the standing disciplines, however, there will always be theories that present themselves as alternatives to a transcendental argument. Or more precisely, the proponent of the transcendental argument is not in a position to rule out such alternatives. Kelsen, in a word, faces a dead end with all three types of theory. Natural law theory and fact-based legal positivism are indefensible, he assures us, and his own appeal to Kant's transcendental argument proves to be indefensible too. How to proceed from here? Adolf Julius Merkel, the most gifted of Kelsen's colleagues, with the most profound knowledge of Kelsen's legal philosophy among all those in the Vienna School of Legal Theory, wrote that Kant was Kelsen's spiritual father. To follow Merkel here, without running afoul of the unworkable Kantian transcendental argument, as it is applied in legal science, we might turn to the Fendesiacal neo-Kantians. They departed from Kant on, among other things, this very issue, the Kantian transcendental argument. In the course of what amounts to a veritable transformation of Kant's philosophy as we know it from the first critique, the neo-Kantians resorted to Kantian regulative principles. And Kelsen, I shall be arguing, is best understood as following their lead. To argue along these lines requires some fairly elaborate stage setting. Specifically, I provide in the second section of the paper a sketch of the Marburg neo-Kantians' departure from the Kant of the transcendental analytic in the first critique. Then I return in section 3 to Kant and to Kelsen, in particular to Kant's regulative principles in the first critique, his common ground with the Marburg neo-Kantians and to Kelsen's basic norm, understood now as a regulative principle. And then I invite attention in section 4, shifting gears at this point, to Kelsen's doctrines of empowerment and liability. Finally, in a brief closing section, I bring together the basic norm qua regulative principle drawn from section 3 and the doctrines of empowerment and liability drawn from section 4. My central thesis is that the basic norm demands the systematization of the law to the greatest extent possible. This systematization aims at recasting legal norms in the modalities of empowerment and liability, an enterprise reflecting the work of the Marburg neo-Kantians. Section 2 on the Marburg neo-Kantians' departure from Kant. Kelsen, as his explicit endorsement of Kant's philosophy suggests, aims to apply bits and pieces of Kant's transcendental analytic with an eye to adducing a transcendental argument in legal science. In this endeavor, he apparently believes he is following the lead of Hermann Cohen of the Marburg School of Neo-Kantianism. But Kelsen is mistaken. While it may well appear as though Cohen's work represented a continuation of Kant's program, the truth lies elsewhere. The transcendental method of the Marburg School, developed above all by Cohen, has as its point of departure the fact of science. As Cohen writes, and this is a quotation from a text of Cohen's, the stars in the heavens are not the objects that this transcendental method would consider. Rather, the transcendental perspective is focused on the calculations of astronomy. It is these facts of scientific reality that are, so to speak, what is actual and calls for explanation. What underlies this reality, given in such facts? What are the conditions of this certainty from which the visibly actual draws its reality? It is these facts, born by laws, that are the objects of inquiry, not the things we call stars. It is the search for, and I quote Cohen's phrase, these facts born by laws, end of quote, a search dictated by regulative principles that is characteristic of Marburg neo-Kantianism. Indeed, the prominent second-generation Marburg neo-Kantian Ernst Cassirer recasts causality itself in regulative terms. And I quote briefly from Cassirer, the search for ever more general laws is a basic feature, a regulative principle of our thinking. It is precisely this regulative principle and nothing else that we call the law of causality. In this sense, it is an a priori given, a transcendental law, because a proof of it from experience is not possible. But it is also true that we have no other warrant for its applicability than its success. End of quote. That Cohen's understanding of the philosopher's task differs from Kant's is no accident. Philosophy in Germany was in a state of great flux at mid-century. The earlier Hegelian consensus had collapsed, and scientific positivism took its place. So it was that psychologism, which in the early 19th century had run counter to the prevailing post-Kantian idealism, gained enormously in prominence by mid-century. Psychologistic readings of Kant, familiar from Fries and Benecke in the early days of psychologism, were now being endorsed and even further developed by some of the leading theorists of the day, not least among them the physicist, physiologist, and philosopher Hermann von Helmholtz. In his early work in the 1860s, Cohen too proceeded from a psychological standpoint, having been influenced in his Berlin period by Steinthal, a follower of Herbart. Cohen's early commitment to psychology is reflected, not least of all, in studies on Plato. For example, his essay of 1866 entitled, and I'll quote the title, "The Platonic Theory of Ideas Developed Psychologically," end of quote. Still, as early as the first edition of his treatise on Kant's theory of experience, published in 1871, Cohen puts considerable distance between his own program and what he sees as psychological doctrines in Kant's philosophy. Cohen's emancipation from psychology in his own philosophical research is not matched by any effort on his part to emancipate Kant from the 19th century perception of Kant's philosophy as being fraught with psychological elements. On the contrary, as Cohen puts it in a monograph of 1883, while Kant, quote, and I'm quoting Cohen now from the monograph, while Kant struggles with psychological ideas and demands, end of quote, he, Cohen, seeks, and I quote again, to render objective in the letter and spirit of Kant's critical system reason in science, end of quote. In particular, Kant's transcendental aesthetic, his appeal to space and time as pure forms of sensibility, remains, so Cohen, psychological through and through, and is philosophically, and I quote, a triviality, end of quote. It was clear to Cohen and to others in the Marburg School that the Kantian notion of two independent stems of human knowledge, namely the receptive faculty or sensibility and the faculty of understanding, must be rejected. Moreover, the elimination by the Marburg neo-Kantians of an independent receptive faculty means that a constitutive dimension, as this is understood in Kant's first critique, has no place in their philosophy. An unusually outspoken transformation of the Kantian transcendental philosophy is found in Cassir's work. In his treatise of 1910, Substance and Function, perhaps his best-known work, Cassir, following Cohen, rejects the notion of sensibility as an independent receptive faculty. The notion of matter, stemming in Kant's philosophy from sensibility, and the notion of form, stemming in Kant's philosophy from the categories of the understanding, are indissolubly correlated. Cassir goes on to argue for the necessity, in comparing competing hypotheses, of an ultimate standard, which he understands in terms of, and I quote, universal elements of form that persist through every change in the particular material content of experience, end of quote. Cassir calls these elements the ultimate logical invariance of experience, and the goal is to provide a complete inventory of these invariants, even if that ideal cannot in practice be achieved. I quote from Cassir on this point: "It may be that this goal, arriving at an inventory, a complete inventory of the logical invariance of experience, it may be that this goal is not perfectly achieved at any given stage of knowledge. The goal nevertheless remains as a demand, prescribing a fixed direction to the continuous unfolding and evolution of the systems of experience themselves," end of quote. This short statement of Cassir's invites attention to two distinguishing characteristics of regulative principles. First, it is recognized that the goal may not be achievable. Second, the demand remains continuously to try to achieve the goal, to approximate the ideal. Third section, Kant on regulative principles and the Kelsenian counterpart. Regulative principles stem from Kant. In the lengthy transcendental dialectic of Kant's first critique, these principles are regulative in two different senses. In the first sense, to which Kant devotes hundreds of pages, Kant understands the metaphysical ideas of God, freedom, and immortality as regulative ideas. He means that we may act as if the belief in God, freedom, and immortality were true, but that to attempt to demonstrate the truth of such beliefs would be a mistake. A purported demonstration would represent an illegitimate use of reason going beyond the limits of possible experience. Regulative principles in this first sense are not our concern here. In his appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, Kant depicts regulative principles in a second sense. Earlier in the first critique, Kant distinguishes three cognitive powers or faculties. All cognition begins, he says, with sensibility, proceeds from there to understanding, and ends with reason. Corresponding to sensibility are the forms of sensibility, corresponding to the understanding of the categories of the understanding, and finally, corresponding to reason are the ideas of reason. As noted above, the ideas of reason, the regulative ideas, play a heuristic role in the Transcendental Dialectic. Kant aims to show why purported demonstrations of the truth of metaphysical ideas represent an illegitimate use of reason. There is also a legitimate use of reason, as Kant shows in the appendix. Here we encounter regulative principles in the second sense. The definitive passage reads, and you'll have to be patient with me here, long quotation from Kant, if we consider in their entire range the cognitions acquired by the understanding, we find that what is peculiar to reason in its stance vis-a-vis these cognitions is that it prescribes and seeks to bring about, and here's the key notion, the systematization of cognition. That is, to exhibit the interconnection of cognition based on a single principle. This unity of reason always presupposes an idea, namely the idea of the form of a whole of cognition, a whole that precedes the determinate cognition of the parts and that contains the conditions for determining a priori the position of each part and its relation to the other parts. Accordingly, this idea postulates complete unity of the cognition acquired by the understanding, whereby this cognition becomes not a mere contingent aggregate, but a system interconnected in accordance with necessary laws. End of the long quote. Here, Kant introduces the regulative principle of systematicity. His reference here in the first critique to, and I quote his phrase, the systematization of cognition marks the initial appearance and the controlling example of a regulative principle in this second sense. With the phrase, the idea of the form of a whole of cognition, Kant gives expression to systematicity, to the unity sought by reason. This is the task of bringing the parts of a whole together in a unity. Reason in lending order to cognition goes well beyond the understanding, whose role is limited to the application of categories to sensibility, to the data of sense. The task of systematization must be undertaken lest our cognitions remain disconnected, in Kant's lovely phrase, a mere rhapsody, rather than a system of significance both for scientific inquiry and for the formation of beliefs generally. This task is left to reason, which has us, as Kant puts it, interrogating nature. My proposal in this lecture is to conceive of Kelsen's basic norm as a regulative principle, to ascribe to the basic norm a systematizing function, in other words, to construe the basic norm as a reflection of Kant's regulative principle in the second sense. I recognize that this proposal is unorthodox. Normally, the function of the basic norm is understood as a grounding function, and Kant speaks of a grounding function in the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law. An orthodox reading, however, is part and parcel of the problem I laid out in section 1, namely that the grounding function of the basic norm presupposes a sound transcendental argument, and no Kantian transcendental argument applied in the standing disciplines, here legal science, is sound. Thus, following Merkel's maxim, I am resorting to a Kantian alternative that preserves something of the Kantian dimension of Kelsen's pure theory of law without running up against a transcendental argument that is unworkable in this context. Now, one possible objection to an interpretation of Kelsen's basic norm in terms of a regulative function can be anticipated right at the outset. As Cassirer points out, the goals sought by pursuing the dictate of a regulative principle cannot, by its very nature qua ideal, be fully realized. But, so the objection goes, the leitmotifs of Kelsen's legal philosophy are not ideals, they are doctrines. That is, the normativity of the law, however it is to be understood in the end, is a doctrine rather than an ideal. That is, the law is normative. Membership as the prominent criterion of legal validity is not an ideal, rather the legal rule is valid only if it belongs to an efficacious legal system. The answer to this objection is straightforward. The objection would count only if the basic norm qua regulative principle were directed to such doctrines as these. The basic norm, however, is directed elsewhere, namely to the quest for systematicity in legal science. Textual support for an interpretation of the basic norm in these terms is found in Kelsen's lovely little monograph of 1928, The Philosophical Foundations of Natural Law Theory and Legal Positivism. There he submits that the basic norm underwrites the quest for systematicity. I quote, "With the help of the basic norm, the legal material created by bylaws, ordinances, enactments, and the like must lend itself to an interpretation as a meaningful whole. That is, as something altogether reasonable." End of quote. Legal material with the help of the basic norm, as Kelsen puts it here, is to be given a systematic interpretation as a meaningful whole. Kelsen pursues this further with greater emphasis on the role of the basic norm as regulative. Here, another quotation from the 1928 monograph that I mentioned a moment ago. If the system of positive law norms, which is constructed on the edifice of the basic norm, is supposed to be a meaningful whole, an intelligible construct, a possible object of cognition or knowledge, and this must be presupposed from the standpoint of legal science, which aims to comprehend its object, and in this very connection resorts to the hypothesis of the basic norm, then the basic norm must offer the guarantee therefore. End of quote. Save for these passages, there is scant textual support in Kelsen's writings for the interpretation of the basic norm as a regulative principle. Kelsen himself is wedded, after all, to the Kant of the transcendental analytic. But it is the Kant of the appendix to the transcendental dialectic that is a key source in the work of the Marburg Neo-Kantians. Since the attribution to Kelsen of a basic norm qua regulative principle is expressly a part of a reconstruction of his philosophy in genuinely Neo-Kantian terms, the reconstruction calls only for the caveat that its value will be determined by its explanatory power. And now I shift gears in section 4 to talk about Kelsen's doctrines of empowerment and liability, and then come back to the two themes, the basic norm on the one hand, these doctrines on the other, in a short closing section. Empowerment as a modality in Kelsen's legal theory has received little attention in the literature, as Ulises Schmill and I well know. No less for that, and Ulises and I are in complete agreement here, empowerment and empowering norms prove to be fundamental. As early as the Hauptprobleme, the massive Habilitationsschrift of 1911, which, as you of course know, is available in Spanish, Kelsen poses the question of, and I quote from that work, the ideal linguistic form of the legal norm, end of quote. From the beginning, Kelsen treated the hypothetically formulated sanction norm addressed to the legal official as the primary norm. By contrast, the command imposed on the legal subject is merely a secondary norm, which, Kelsen goes on, and I quote, is fully superfluous. For it says, I'm still quoting, to the subject nothing different from what the norms of the first kind say, end of quote. The key question not addressed by Kelsen in the early work is this: what is the modality of the hypothetically formulated sanction norm addressed to the legal official? In the early work, Kelsen gives the impression that the official is being commanded to impose a sanction. Not until a lengthy paper of the late 1930s, in response to George Sell's theory of public international law, does Kelsen offer his first systematic answer to this question: what is the modality of the hypothetically formulated sanction norm? He writes, and I quote, "The legal obligation of an individual to behave in a certain way is recognized as given only if, in the event of the opposite behavior, another individual is empowered by the legal system to impose a sanction on the first individual," end of quote. By itself, this passage does not establish the priority of empowerment, but an additional all-important point bears on the matter. The empowering norm found in this passage from the paper of the late 1930s, discovered and published only a half-century later, the empowering norm found in this passage is correctly identified as Kelsen's primary norm, the hypothetically formulated sanction norm. The legal obligation of an individual, his phrase in this quotation, is a secondary norm. From the beginning, Kelsen regards the secondary norm as superfluous, as dispensable. These lines, coupling the new development in Kelsen's reply to Sell with the familiar Kelsenian doctrine that the secondary norm is superfluous, open the door to Kelsen's métier view. Empowerment represents the ideal linguistic form of the legal norm, and legal norms in their reconstructed form are empowerments. Kelsen develops the view further in General Theory of Law and State, the treatise of 1945, and then again in the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law. The development that emerges clearly in General Theory, the 1945 treatise, is Kelsen's new reading of the ought in the primary norm. As already noted, Kelsen in the early work appears to be using the ought to give expression to an obligation. Thus, the ought in Kelsen's hypothetically formulated sanction norm is understood as serving to impose a conditional obligation on the legal official. In General Theory, the 1945 treatise, Kelsen defends a different view. He contends, albeit less than clearly, that the ought need not coincide with the concept of legal obligation. Rather, the ought in the primary norm serves as a placeholder, akin really to a variable expression, indicating that under certain conditions a sanction can be imposed, that is to say, an official is empowered to impose a sanction. This is the basic reading of the ought, thus understood. What of the case where there is also an obligation to impose the sanction? Kelsen replies, and I'm quoting from the 1945 treatise, under the present definition of legal obligation, the legal norm that obligates the subject to refrain from the delict by attaching a sanction thereto does not stipulate any legal obligation of executing the sanction, of applying the norm itself. The judge can be legally obligated to execute the sanction in the sense in which the subject is obligated to refrain from the delict, to obey the legal norm, only if there is a further norm that attaches a further sanction to the non-execution of the first sanction, end of quote. Kelsen insists that no regress is implied here. That is, in a system of positive law, there will always be a highest level in the hierarchical ordering of the legal system. At this highest level, only the empowerment to impose a sanction is possible, for the presence of an obligation to impose a sanction would presuppose a still higher level in the hierarchy. These details of Kelsen's empowerment doctrine are not clear in general theory, the 1945 treatise, but Kelsen pursues the doctrine further. In particular, he takes up the doctrine again in the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law, where he defends expressly in the language of empowerment the very doctrine he had introduced in the late 1930s in his study of Sell's theory. I quote from the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law: if a delict specified by a certain legal system is committed, then a sanction specified by that legal system ought to be imposed. Here the ought covers both the case in which the official is simply empowered and the case in which he is commanded to impose the sanction, end of quote. Query, when is the modality of empowerment called for and when the command? Kelsen answers clearly, second edition of the Pure Theory of Law, and I quote again, the imposition of a sanction is commanded, has the content of legal obligation, if its omission is made the condition for a sanction. Where this is not the case, the official can only be taken to be empowered to impose the sanction, not commanded, end of quote. Where an official's failure to impose a sanction, the omission, is itself understood as the condition for a sanction. The expression condition is shorthand for the antecedent of the completive, hypothetically formulated norm empowering a higher official to impose a sanction. To be sure, in the second edition of the Pure Theory and elsewhere, Kelsen has a great deal to say about obligation, permission, and the like, the familiar deontic categories, no surprise there. But in chapter 4 of the treatise on legal statics, Kelsen is working, for the most part, within the framework of the reconstructed legal norm, whose operative modality is empowerment. Summary thus far: having posed in the Hauptprobleme the question of the ideal linguistic form of the legal norm, Kelsen arrives ultimately at a defense of empowerment. The ideal linguistic form of the legal norm is the hypothetically formulated norm empowering an official to impose a sanction under certain conditions. The ought in Kelsen's work, beginning in the 1940s, is a placeholder, as I mentioned, akin to a variable expression, and Kelsen has no independent doctrine of obligation in his reconstruction of the legal norm, much less a doctrine that lies at the core of his theory. Rather, obligation is a derivative notion constructed from pairings of empowering norms then at adjacent levels in the hierarchy, which we know as the legal system. Still to be discussed in this section, albeit very briefly, is Kelsen's understanding of the correlative notion, that of liability. The correlative notion, the correlative relation that holds between empowerment and liability is clear. That is, a party A is liable to the exercise of power with respect to a matter X, by a party B if party B has power vis-a-vis A with respect to X. And by the same token, if A is immune to the exercise of power by B with respect to X, then B has no power vis-a-vis A with respect to X. So far, no surprises. What is interesting and perhaps even surprising to those who have not looked at Kelsen on empowerment and liability is that liability, too, turns up as a concept developed by Kelsen, albeit obliquely. Here the key is Kelsen's notion, a difficult notion, of peripheral imputation. Peripheral imputation links material facts, Tatbestände. As Kelsen writes in the Allgemeine Staatslehre, a huge treatise of the mid-1920s, and I quote, "Peripheral imputation always leads from one material fact to nothing other than another material fact," end of quote. Two questions arise. What exactly would Kelsen have us understand by material facts? And how is peripheral imputation linking material facts to be formulated? Kelsen answers the first question in terms of legal condition and legal consequence. More precisely, in terms of the state of affairs, counting as the legal condition in a particular instance, and in Hofeldian parlance, the legal position that emerges as its legal consequence. This seems to be an odd fit, for a legal consequence does not obviously count as an instance of a material fact. Rather, in a hypothetically formulated legal norm, a material fact falling within the scope of the antecedent clause of the norm triggers the legal consequence, establishing in Kelsen's doctrine the legal position of liability that counts as the legal consequence, and liability is not understood in the law as a material fact. Still, in introducing peripheral imputation, Kelsen brings together material facts thus understood. He writes, and I quote, that if the mode of linking material facts is causality in the one case, it is imputation in the other, end of quote. What is more, he uses legal condition and legal consequence alongside cause and effect as the respective relata of these very ordering principles, imputation and causality. That is, he understands their respective relata as species of the genus material fact. The second question addresses the formulation of peripheral imputation. Kelsen speaks of peripheral imputation as, and I quote, the particular lawfulness, the autonomy, Eigengesetzlichkeit of the law, end of quote. What does he mean? Autonomy speaks to the nomological character of the law. It is therefore reasonable to assume that peripheral imputation will lend itself to a formulation that reflects the nomological character of the law. The formulation that emerges is, if you will, a subjectless rendering of peripheral imputation, that is to say, a formulation that does not include an ascription of liability to a legal subject. It might read, if an act of a certain type, namely a delict, takes place, that act is treated as, and I'm quoting this expression since it's a bit curious, liability ascribing, end of quote. And I'll return to liability ascribing in a moment. This formulation captures the import of peripheral imputation, and it does so in two respects. First, it reflects the link between the two material facts. Second, the link confined here to the act and to the liability, so to speak, imputed to the act, is a necessary link. In this way, the nomological character of the law, its autonomy, is underscored. As Kelsen writes, a good passage here from the preface to the second printing of the Hauptprobleme, if there is the necessity of an absolute must when the law of nature links cause and effect, so there is the equally rigorous ought when the law of normativity sets out the synthesis of conditioning and conditioned material facts. In the sphere of the law, or in legal reality, delict is linked to punishment with the same necessity as in the sphere of nature, or in natural reality, cause is linked to effect, end of quote. This is close to being correct as a statement of Kelsen's position, although one wrinkle has to be ironed out. Kelsen is not claiming, Appearances to the contrary here notwithstanding, he is not claiming a necessary link between the delict and the actual imposition of punishment. For, as we know, and as Kelsen makes perfectly clear elsewhere, and I quote, "In the system of nature, punishment may fail to materialize for one reason or another," end of quote. It is not punishment, but criminal liability, and by the same token, civil liability, that figures in the necessary nomological or law-like link. In the most general terms, liability serves in this formulation as the second relatum, the second material fact. The relation of liability to the act to which it is imputed is a necessary relation. By contrast, the actual imposition of punishment in the criminal law, the actual execution of judgment in the civil law is, of course, a contingent matter. Now back, very briefly, to the notion of liability ascribing. Where a legal proceeding in fact takes place, then the liability ascribing character of the act is implemented. That is, liability is then ascribed to an individual. And the correlative empowerment to impose the sanction then comes into play. The result is the familiar pair of correlatives, empowerment and liability, and they serve in Kelsen's legal theory as the basic modalities of the law. I think you will be pleased to learn that I am coming to the end. You've been very patient. A very short concluding section 5, literally less than a single page. Bringing together then the notion of the basic norm on the one hand and the basic modalities on the other. I am interpreting Kelsen's basic norm as a regulative principle, thereby bringing it into line with a major thrust of the Marburg Neo-Kantians. The basic norm serves then to dictate the systematization of the law. My thesis here is that an effort completely to recast the norms of the Kelsenian legal system in the modalities of empowerment and liability represents a program of systematization. And this program represents, in turn, an ideal. The ideal is sharply to be distinguished from the doctrinal point that obligation in Kelsen's pure theory of law is a derivative concept, whereas empowerment is primary and fundamental. If my argument on Kelsen's behalf is correct, these doctrinal points are the case, just as the validity of legal norms is the case, the normativity of the law is the case, and so on. Going beyond the doctrinal points, which are not addressed by the basic norm qua regulative principle, there is the goal of systematization, understood as an ideal. In closing, I return to Kelsen's ultimate aim in legal philosophy, an issue I raised at the outset. Kelsen is quite clearly not striving to resolve the classical problem of the justification of our obligation to obey the law. Rather, he is striving to provide a firm foundation for legal science. It is right and proper, I believe, to think of Kelsen as a philosopher of science, legal science, of course. I thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Paulson, por su brillante exposición. Solo para apuntar a alguna cosa adicional, aunque ahora no tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas en relación al paper del profesor Paulson, este viernes a las 8:30 están cordialmente invitados en la mañana al seminario que dará el profesor Paulson en la sala de maestros, donde se podrá discutir con mayor detalle y profundidad estas ideas. Ahora cedo la palabra al profesor Schmill para las palabras inaugurales de nuestra cátedra.
finalizar uno de los seminarios de los profesores de tiempo completo en el Departamento de Derecho que acostumbramos celebrar cada viernes, el director del departamento aquí presente, Jorge Servio Herrán, anunció frente a todos los profesores que el ITAM había decidido crear la cátedra cuya inauguración ahora celebramos. Al oírlo, quedé profundamente sorprendido, incluso desconcertado. Di las gracias por el reconocimiento otorgado a mi persona y como no había tenido noticia alguna sobre la posible proposición en ese sentido, me di a investigar el origen de la misma. No sé todavía a ciencia cierta quién fue el autor de tal proposición, pero sospecho que surgió de mi amigo Rodolfo Vázquez y del director Jorge Serdio, los cuales hasta la fecha han guardado un prudente silencio. El agrado con que recibió el conjunto de profesores la creación de la cátedra fue un signo muy significativo sobre la forma como ha evolucionado lo que podríamos llamar la cultura científica sobre el derecho desde la época de mi juventud hasta la fecha actual. Antes de pasar a relatar el proceso histórico evolutivo de esta cultura, tal como yo la he experimentado en el curso de medio siglo, quisiera agradecer sinceramente al doctor Alejandro Hernandez, vicerrector de este instituto, al ministro Fernando Franco, por la participación que han tenido en el proceso de aceptación por este instituto y la Suprema Corte de Justicia en el patrocinio de la cátedra. Al director de la Escuela Libre de Derecho, Fauci Hamner, no presente en este momento. Igualmente quiero agradecer a Jorge Servio Herrán, director del departamento, los conceptos sobre mi persona vertidos en sus palabras de presentación y haber recibido con beneplácito la creación de ella. De igual forma, quiero agradecer al ministro Juan Silva Mesa, presidente de la Suprema Corte de Justicia, su aceptación de patrocinar esta cátedra, con lo que han mostrado su aprecio y amistad a un viejo compañero de labores del máximo tribunal. Y al rector de este instituto, doctor Arturo Fernández, por su aquiescencia en la creación de esta cátedra. Evidentemente, quiero expresar mi alegría de que el orador principal de este evento haya sido el sabio profesor Stanley Paulson, con quien me liga una estrecha amistad que me honra y me llena de satisfacción por la calidez de su trato y por la identidad de formación teórica y de intereses intelectuales centrados en la obra del jurista vienés Hans Kelsen. Más adelante entenderán la razón por la que nos dirigimos a nuestras personas con las palabras de hermano dinosaurio, brother dinosaur. Quiero reconocer ante ustedes la satisfacción que me produce la presencia de Bonnie Lichevsky de Paulson, quien ha trabajado intensamente en traducciones de difíciles textos kelsenianos, difundiendo su pensamiento en el ámbito de habla inglesa. E igualmente agradezco a todos mis familiares y amigos que me acompañan y al público presente lo que vivo como un regalo exquisito que me da la vida. Quiero empezar mis palabras con una nota estridente que puede desconcertar a muchos de los oyentes, pero que me ayudará a expresar aquello que quiero decirles. Para ello, quisiera, por vía de contraste con lo que quiero decirles, relatar un mito que expresaba de manera intuitiva las experiencias de aquel inteligentísimo pueblo de la antigüedad, los griegos, creadores de los fundamentos más valiosos de nuestra cultura. Nietzsche, Federico Nietzsche, dice en su libro de juventud, El nacimiento de la tragedia, escrito cuando se encontraba entusiasmado por la cultura griega y por la música, que el griego era un pueblo tan excitable en sus sentimientos, tan impetuoso en sus deseos, tan excepcionalmente capacitado para el sufrimiento, que conoció y sintió los horrores y espantos de la existencia, dice Nietzsche textualmente, lo que expresó en un mito muy impresionante en el que expone el sentido de la vida para algunos de ellos. Nietzsche dice, y cito, una vieja leyenda cuenta que durante mucho tiempo el rey Midas había intentado cazar en el bosque al sabio Sileno, acompañante de Dioniso, sin poder cogerlo. Cuando por fin cayó en sus manos, el rey pregunta qué es lo mejor y más preferible para el hombre. Rígido e inmóvil calla el demonio, hasta que forzado por el rey, acaba pronunciando estas palabras en medio de una risa estridente. Estirpe miserable de un día, hijos del azar y la fatiga, ¿por qué me fuerzas a decirte lo que para ti sería muy ventajoso no oír? Lo mejor de todo es totalmente inalcanzable para ti. No haber nacido, no ser, ser nada. Y lo mejor en segundo lugar es para ti morir pronto. Este impresionante relato lo he presentado ante ustedes por vía de contraste. Debemos recordar que ya Thomas Hobbes, el gran teórico político inglés, habló sobre la guerra de todos contra todos y los inconvenientes terribles de tal estado, por lo que su teoría propone como solución a ese estado y la obtención del bien supremo de la paz. Lo anterior lo digo para relacionarlo con una breve descripción de lo que los mexicanos hemos vivido en los últimos 50 años. Repasando el curso de mi vida y posiblemente ustedes también, si recuerdan el transcurso de sus vidas, desde la perspectiva que ahora tienen, he llegado a la conclusión de que México me ha brindado épocas de verdadero interés y sorpresa. Durante más de 70 años, cerca de 80 años, ha existido en México, a pesar de todas las penosas vicisitudes por las que ha transcurrido su historia, un periodo de paz permanente, pues no hemos vivido en todo el país las convulsiones mortales de una guerra civil o revolucionaria, ni los horrores de una guerra con una potencia extranjera, como tantos otros países la han tenido que padecer en el siglo XX y en los principios del XXI. Lamentablemente, a últimas fechas, la destrucción y las muertes tan comunes en otros lugares del planeta han hecho acto de presencia en nuestro país, pero afortunadamente no han logrado destruir la estructura jurídica y política de nuestras instituciones. Los vicios de nuestro carácter, los conflictos internos, la corrupción que aparece por todos lados, en todas las circunstancias, nos han generado dudas sobre el destino de nuestra vida nacional, pero sin embargo hemos tenido la prudencia y la mesura necesarias para mantener en la lejanía el flagelo de la guerra civil y las desgracias connaturales a ellas. Si el viejo Sileno, acompañante de Dionisio en el mito griego, hubiera vivido en México durante estos años, hubiera podido decir, invirtiendo su sabiduría, lo peor de todo es morir pronto, y lo peor en segundo lugar es llegar a morir alguna vez. Todas nuestras instituciones y normas que establecen, que las establecen, son medios sociales para resolver los conflictos que se suscitan entre los hombres. Al perseguir sus propias finalidades, guiados por el egoísmo connatural e ineradicable del ser humano. Y puede decirse que el derecho es uno, evidentemente no el único, de los medios más eficaces para resolver los conflictos inherentes a la vida comunitaria. En tiempos revueltos, con la oscuridad de las diversas crisis, no es extraño encontrar tesis desesperadas que intentan fijar de una vez por todas una legitimidad que sea inamovible y definitiva. Esto entraña un grave peligro que expondré a continuación. Leyendo un párrafo del profesor argentino Ernesto Garzón Valdés, encontré un pequeño texto que quisiera leerles. Cito: una simple mirada a los acontecimientos de nuestros días conduce necesariamente a la intelección de que el derecho natural celebra su renacimiento. Tras decenios de un estéril positivismo, están maduros nuevamente los tiempos para la grandeza y profundidad del pensamiento justnaturalista. Las ansias de valores atemporalmente válidos dirigen la consideración jurídica por encima del derecho positivo hacia la idea de lo recto y lo bueno. Todo esto conduce al derecho natural. Termina la cita tomada de Ernesto Garzón Valdés. ¿Qué se esconde detrás de estas frases? El autor de este párrafo habla de valores atemporalmente válidos, es decir, no sujetos a circunstancias históricas, coyunturales, para obtener a la manera platónica la idea de lo recto y lo bueno. Habla de la grandeza y profundidad del pensamiento justnaturalista. En resumen, aspira a alcanzar posiciones jurídicas y políticas de carácter absoluto. Sin embargo, las grandes palabras suelen ocultar a veces intenciones aviesas y crueles. El autor de este texto, y es de llamar la atención, parece ser un autor contemporáneo, sus palabras. Su nombre fue Hans Helmut Dietze, el cual escribió su libro en 1936 con el título El derecho natural del presente. Lo paradójico es que la intención de este texto fue justificar el régimen político nacional socialista de Adolfo Hitler. Vienen a mi memoria las frases iniciales de la fundamentación de la metafísica a las costumbres de Immanuel Kant, donde señala las consecuencias de una asunción absolutista de cualquier posición ética o política. Dice que ya sea el entendimiento, el juicio, el gracejo, o como quiera llamarse a los talentos del espíritu, o incluso el valor, la decisión, la perseverancia en los propósitos, son sin duda en muchos aspectos buenos y deseables, pero también pueden convertirse en extraordinariamente malos y perversos si la voluntad que hace uso de esos dones, dice Kant, no es buena. Lo mismo señala respecto del poder, la riqueza, la honra e incluso la salud misma. Como señalara Hamlet en la obra de Shakespeare, un solo defecto en medio de las más excelsas virtudes corrompe al ser humano si se lo lleva a extremos. Reduciendo mis consideraciones a un tema concreto, como lo es la jurisprudencia y la filosofía del derecho, quiero dejar constancia del cambio observable del ambiente cultural sobre la enseñanza del derecho desde la época en que estudié en la Facultad de Derecho y el que ahora impera en México, en particular en este instituto. En la década de los 60 del siglo pasado, la Facultad de Derecho de la UNAM estaba en manos de algunos juristas con ideología radicalmente justnaturalista. Y como toda persona absolutista, ejercían su autoridad y las funciones administrativas que se les había confiado de manera tiránica y arbitraria. Perdón, Sergio, pero así fue. Con ello, quiero decir que no permitían el desarrollo y exposición de teorías y doctrinas que diferían de las que ellos y su camarillo aceptaban y enseñaban. Claro está que con semejantes juristas, la doctrina de Hans Kelsen era violentamente repudiada y pretendían criticarla y refutarla, incluso sin haber leído las obras del jurista vienés ya traducidas al español. Me refiero a la Teoría General del Estado de 1925, traducida genialmente por el profesor español Luis de Gas Lacambra, y la Teoría Pura del Derecho de 1934, traducida por Jorge G. Tejerina. Recuerdo que en los cursos de introducción al estudio del derecho y de filosofía del derecho, si se mencionaba a Kelsen, era para afirmar que su doctrina había sido refutada desde antes que fuera formulada y que era una teoría formalista, alejada de la vida real, palpitante y por tanto totalmente falsa y hueca. Este era el reproche más comúnmente formulado y era considerado como una refutación insuperable. Como era una teoría formalista, lógica pero vacía, repetían el dicto de Schmitt y de Heller de que era una teoría del derecho y del Estado sin derecho y sin Estado. Un amigo mío dijo que las leyes son una teoría del derecho y del Estado sin teoría. Solo había un profesor que en su curso de filosofía del derecho enseñaba la teoría de la escuela vienesa de Kelsen. Me refiero al profesor Guillermo Héctor Rodríguez, al que los maestros naturalistas lo nombraban o se referían a él significativamente diciendo que era el Papa Negro. Gran polemista, enseñaba la doctrina de Kelsen de una manera peculiar, muy intrigante. Era neokantiano afiliado a la escuela de Marburgo y quería sintetizar en una teoría unitaria las tesis de Hermann Cohen, Rudolf Stambler y Hans Kelsen. En alguna medida incompatible, según pienso ahora, especialmente con la teoría de Stambler. Pero lo que decía era brillante y sobre todo muy intrigante. Como él, sus alumnos éramos belicosos y concitábamos la enemistad de todos los profesores. Cada año teníamos que gestionar nuevamente nuestra incorporación como maestros de la facultad y en los exámenes de oposición a los que éramos convocados nos calificaban con notas ínfimas, prefiriendo evidentemente a aquellos sustentantes naturalistas. A mí me llegaron a calificar con 0.01. Los alumnos de Rodríguez, por la identidad de nuestras concepciones tomadas de Kelsen, formábamos un grupo combatido. Entre ellos quiero mencionar a Leandro Azuara Pérez, a Fausto Vallado Berrón, Ariel Peralta García, Armando Morones Ortega, Rolando Tamayo Salvorán y yo. Como una excepción digna de ser mencionada, fue la invitación de Kelsen en el año de 1960, que afortunadamente aceptó y que nos dio la oportunidad de escucharlo de viva voz. Aunque nuestra vocación filosófica era patente, nunca pudimos pertenecer en esa época a alguno de los institutos de investigación de la universidad y tuvimos que dedicarnos a actividades profesionales muy lejanas a la filosofía del derecho y la jurisprudencia teórica. Llama la atención que Leandro Azuara trabajaba en un juzgado de distrito como actuario haciendo notificaciones. Fausto Vallado Berrón llegó a ser magistrado de circuito. Yo fui secretario de Estudio y Cuenta del Tribunal Fiscal de la Federación para desembocar afortunadamente como ministro de la Suprema Corte de Justicia después de haber transitado por diversos puestos administrativos y diplomáticos. Solo Rolando Tamayo pudo desempeñarse como investigador del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas. Mientras todo esto acontecía en México, en Argentina estudiaban intensamente la doctrina de Kelsen con profesores como Ambrosio Gioja y Carlos Cosio, juristas como Carlos Alchurrón, Eugenio Bulíguin, Roberto Bernengo, Ernesto Garzón Valdés, Genaro Carrió, Ricardo Guibur, Ricardo Caracholo, para mencionar algunos ahora conspicuos juristas argentinos. Una vez terminada mi labor como presidente de la Suprema Corte de Justicia, debido a la decapitación que el constituyente permanente hizo de todos los ministros a instancias del recién electo presidente de la República, Ernesto Zedillo, tuve la oportunidad de incorporarme a este instituto que ahora me honra con esta cátedra. En este instituto encontré el ambiente exactamente opuesto al que había vivido en la Facultad de Derecho en la década de los 60 y 70. Una apertura a todas las corrientes doctrinales y el respeto a todos los puntos de vista teóricos. Ernesto Garzón Valdés sugirió a Rodolfo Vázquez tanto la creación de un seminario que llevara el nombre del maestro Eduardo García Maínez, que yo tuve el honor de inaugurar con la primera conferencia, como el proyecto editorial que ha llegado a tener un prestigio internacional, la Biblioteca de Ética, Filosofía del Derecho y Política, con la editorial Fontamara y la revista Isonomía. Dice Rodolfo Vázquez: por esta colección comenzaron a circular los nombres de Hans Kelsen, Alf Ross, Lon Fuller, Norberto Bobbio, Ulrich Klug, Norbert Herster, Manuel Atienza, Carlos Nino, Ricardo Guibourg, Francisco Laporta, Ulises Schmill, Robert Alexi, Aulis Arnio, Owen Fis, Elías Díaz, Fernando Salmerón, Eugenio Buligin, Paolo Cumanducci, Jorge Malem, Alexander Pechenik, Robert Sommers, Gregorio Peces Barba, Michelangelo Bovero, Michel Troper, Luigi Ferraioli y muchos más desde entonces. Además, muchos de estos investigadores han realizado cursos e impartido conferencias en esta sociedad cultural, lo que ha producido que su apertura se amplíe y extienda a otras instituciones de enseñanza del derecho, como la Escuela Libre de Derecho y la Facultad de Derecho de la UNAM. He encontrado una cultura abierta y tolerante a todas las posturas teóricas. No hay dogmatismo alguno que valga. Resulta claro que no todas las líneas de investigación y sus resultados son aceptables por los demás juristas, pero todas tienen, digámoslo así, el derecho de expresarse sin limitación alguna. Es una cultura jurídica abierta, para usar la expresión de Popper, la que he encontrado en este instituto. Lo que me lleva a recordar un pequeño texto de Kelsen, totalmente concordante con lo que he expresado anteriormente sobre el absolutismo. Dice Kelsen al final de su teoría general del Estado: la cuestión decisiva es esta: ¿hay o no un conocimiento de la verdad absoluta, una visión de los valores absolutos? La creencia en una verdad y valores absolutos es el supuesto de una concepción metafísica y sobre todo místico-religiosa del mundo. Pero la negación de este supuesto, la creencia de que el conocimiento humano no puede alcanzar más que verdades y valores relativos, la convicción de que cada verdad y cada valor, tal como el hombre los encuentra, tienen que estar dispuestos en todo momento a retirarse y dejar paso a otros, conduce a la idea del positivismo, es decir, de lo dado, de la mudable y siempre cambiante experiencia, rechazando la hipótesis de un absoluto trascendente a aquella. A esta oposición de conceptos del mundo corresponde la antítesis de estimativas y en especial de actitudes políticas. A la concepción metafísico-absolutista del mundo se ordena una actitud autocrática. Por el contrario, el relativismo crítico se corresponde con el ideario democrático. Esta conferencia del profesor Stanley Paulson es una muestra clarísima de lo que he dicho sobre el carácter abierto de la cultura jurídica que existe en este instituto. Es francamente impensable que hubiéramos podido oír en la década de los 60 del siglo pasado palabras como las de Paulson, que hace una reconstrucción filosófica de la doctrina de Kelsen, exponiendo las tesis de la escuela neokantiana de Marburgo, de los dos de sus más conspicuos representantes, Hermann Cohen y Ernest Cassirer. Stanley Paulson ha rechazado con toda claridad la frustrada interpretación de la obra de Kelsen hecha por el profesor Joseph Raz, que es una más de las variantes del justnaturalismo que pretende fundamentar la normatividad del derecho positivo en la ética o en la teoría de la justicia, y la tesis de Robert Barter de un positivismo jurídico con base factual. Concuerdo plenamente con Stanley de que existe una tercera vía con base kantiana para fundar la normatividad autónoma del orden jurídico. Nos ha ofrecido Stanley en su plática dos cosas de suma importancia teórica: una fundamentación filosófica de la teoría del derecho de base kantiana y neokantiana, y un proyecto de reconstrucción de la jurisprudencia con base en el concepto de la facultad, empowerment. Ha trazado las líneas fundamentales de tal reconstrucción, la que hay que seguir desarrollando y pensando sobre todas las consecuencias doctrinales que entraña. La prueba decisiva de esta reconstrucción doctrinal consiste, como lo dice Stanley, en su poder explicativa, aunque ya había sido dicho por Kelsen en sus problemas capitales y repetido en la segunda edición de la teoría pura del derecho de 60 y en la teoría general de las normas y en alguna publicación posterior. Creo que la formulación de Stanley de la forma lingüística ideal de la proposición jurídica establece con claridad una comprensión del principio de la imputación periférica, análogo al principio de la causalidad en las ciencias naturales, con base en el concepto de la facultad. Por vez primera en las facultades de Derecho se ha mencionado el argumento trascendental kantiano como un intento de fundamentar la normatividad del derecho. Stanley rechaza esta posibilidad, la que habrá que discutir con detenimiento. Sin embargo, como ustedes lo han oído, acude a la segunda versión de los principios regulativos kantianos para afirmar que su tesis novedosa consiste en entender la norma básica de Kelsen como un principio regulativo kantiano cuya función esencial es la sistematización de los materiales dados a las ciencias jurídicas. Esto significa adicionalmente que entonces debe concebirse al derecho positivo como un todo congruente, como reflejo de la unidad de las disciplinas jurídicas obtenida por la aplicación de la norma básica de Kelsen. Stanley sostiene que esta es una aportación del neocantismo de Kelsen. Y para terminar, debo hacer la siguiente observación en concordancia con la función sistematizadora de la norma básica. El jurista que acepte una posición relativista no puede aceptar cualquier opinión parcial o arbitraria. En materia científica pueden postularse todas las hipótesis posibles para resolver el conjunto de problemas históricamente planteado a la disciplina correspondiente, pero opera una exigencia insoslayable. La hipótesis que se postule ha de resolver todos los problemas que las hipótesis anteriores solucionaban y algunos más. La teoría de Kelsen exige ser analizada, criticada y, si es posible, superada, siempre y cuando se cumpla con la exigencia que he formulado, que resuelva, por lo menos con la nueva conjetura que se postule, y si es posible, algunos nuevos de los problemas que han sido tratados con éxito en la teoría de la Escuela de Viena. Muchas gracias.